Welcome to the Buddhistisches Tor Berlin podcast. Here we share talks and reflections from our Buddhist center in Berlin, exploring themes such as meditation, ethics, and the path of awakening in everyday life. We are part of the Rijumati Buddhist community, and our talks are offered freely in a spirit of generosity. We hope this episode supports your practice and your life.
And the talk today, he's written a talk, A Light in Dark Times, a Buddhist response to the world crisis. Great. Please, Rijumati. Good.
Thank you, Lalitaratna. And it's lovely to be here in Berlin, in the Buddhist gate, Buddhistisches Tor. It's sort of an oasis of peace, friendliness, clarity, meaning in the middle of this great city. So I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. And I want to start by expressing my gratitude to my teacher, Ugyen Sangharakshita, founder of Rijumati, passing the three jewels to me and so many people, the Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, giving my life so much meaning. So, he's a great inspiration to many of us in the Buddhist world. And also thanks to the wonderful Lalitaratna for doing the readings, but also just for his decades of inspiration and friendliness that he's emanated for so many people over all these years. And if I get too serious, because it's a serious theme, he's going to be the comic relief. So.
It comes easily.
So, friends, the world is burning. It's the best way I can say it. The world is burning. We're facing really terrible issues and problems. As you all know, you all listen to the news. We've got war in Europe, in the Middle East, in Africa. We've got countries in Latin America, very unstable, threats of war there. There's injustice, there's prejudice, huge inequality. I mean, the super rich and those who can't even afford basics of life. There's destruction, contamination of our environment. And obviously, there's climate change, climate disruption. I live in Spain, and it's literally burning. The south of Spain, people were killed just recently. So our world is burning. And the question that comes to any aware, thinking person is, why is this happening? You're all here in a Buddhist center, you're thinking about yourself, about the world. Why is this happening? And of course, it's a very complex set of conditions, many causes and conditions. We've got a huge human population with the needs of feeding that. There's consumerism, there's a technological development that no one can control. There's the economics of exploitation, capitalist economics, exploitation of people and resources by corporations that are not really accountable to any country anymore. Vicious political doctrines that are promoted by certain politicians, nationalism, racism, sexism, the list goes on, doesn't it? So the world's burning, and these are we could call them extrinsic or external reasons why it's burning, all of these things I've mentioned. And it's important to realize that this is not new. This is not a new phenomenon. If you look through human history, the world has been burning for a long time, in a certain sense, although it's intensified by the problems we as 9 billion people and so on this planet are facing. Even the history of Berlin, this amazing city which rose from the ashes of destruction, you can see that this is not a new phenomenon, but it's very immediate, it's very intense. So these are the external reasons. Now, the Buddha also noted that the world is burning. He talked about this over 2,500 years ago. And as always, the Buddha had a very distinctive and unique way of expressing this. And his take on the reasons for this come with this very deep view, very clear view. So I'm going to ask Lalitaratna to give our first reading, which is a very famous Buddhist text. It's from the ancient Buddhist, the Pali Canon, called the Fire Sermon, or the Discourse on Fire.
Bhikkhus, all is burning. And what is all that is burning? The eye is burning. Visible forms are burning. Eye consciousness is burning. Eye contact is burning. Also, whether pleasant or painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that arises with eye contact as its condition, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, with the fire of hate, with the fire of delusion. It is burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair. I say the ear is burning, sounds are burning, the nose is burning, odours are burning, the tongue is burning, flavours are burning, the body is burning, tangibles are burning, the mind is burning, mental objects are burning, mind consciousness is burning, mind contact is burning. Also, the feeling, whether pleasant, painful, or neither painful nor pleasant, that arises with mind contact as its condition, that too is burning. Burning with what? Burning with the fire of lust, the fire of hate, the fire of delusion. It is burning with birth, aging, and death, with sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair, I say.
So they're weighty words, powerful words, huh? And here we begin to see the Buddha's take. He's looking at what we could call the intrinsic, the internal reasons for why the world is burning. So we have the external and the internal, the extrinsic, the intrinsic. And of course, it's absolutely vital that we address the external reasons. You know, we have to have social, political movements that address the poverty, the injustice, the climate problems, bringing the corporations to accountability. We have to address that, yeah? But we also have to address the internal reasons, the intrinsic reasons, because otherwise, and this is shown in history again and again, whatever positive and creative movements for social change arise will be corrupted by those inner defilements or obscurations of greed, hatred, and delusion. You know, why are the big corporations exploiting things like that? Because the people who direct them are working for selfish ends. You know, they're not transformed that in themselves. All of us as human beings, we're born with that tendency, you know, and if you don't work on it, it will manifest. So we have to do both of these things. You know, you only need to see how the most noble ideals can be corrupted. Say we look at the history of the Russian Revolution, great noble ideals of communism and so on, but then the horrors of Stalinism, you know, the tremendous suffering of Russian people during that period in the 30s, and then the whole war which all of Europe suffered. It gets corrupted by those forces. So in order to transform the world, we do have to transform the individual as well. You can't achieve one without the other. In this sense, the Dharma, the Buddha's teaching, is completely radical. It's absolutely radical. It's absolutely pragmatic. It's saying it will not work just to transform the external structures. You have to change the individual as well. It's like a bird. You need the two wings to fly. It's not going to fly with just the one wing. If you just focus on your own inner spiritual work but ignore the world, well, the world will burn. If you just want to do lots of good works in the world but you don't transform yourself, the world will burn. So we have to do both at the same time. The Dharma says this clearly, radically. Our own teacher, Sangharakshita, has said this clearly, radically. And if even one of these things seems like a big challenge, it's a bit overwhelming to think of doing both, huh? How can we contemplate changing both the world and the individual together? So in order to understand this and to see the positive vision of the Dharma, we need to look a bit more deeply at who we are, what we think we are. So all of us tell stories. Whether it's conscious or unconscious, we're all telling ourselves stories about who we are, what we are, in a way, it's the way you have to be as a human being to live in the world. In any sense, you've got to sort of, I'm this kind of person, this is what the world's like. And I want to highlight that the stories we tell ourselves, and particularly the dominant story that our society in the West, but also generally now dominates most of the world, has its own shadows and its own drawbacks, and we need to realise this. So I'm going to compare two different stories about who and what we are as human beings. I'm going to start with the materialist story, which isn't the only story in the modern technological world, but it's the dominant one. You know, there are other religious stories that tell a different story. But the materialist story, I'm going to simplify it pretty basically, but it goes something like this. It says, I'm a collection of atoms. Atoms are made of dead matter. And within my body is this organ we call the brain, which in some mysterious way that science doesn't and can't even explain, creates my consciousness. So my consciousness is just a strange byproduct of complexity in neurons and matter. And it seems that I and all living beings, that's you and all living beings and me, we're just an accident of this material universe. My consciousness is an accidental byproduct of this. My particular life has no very profound meaning apart from propagating my DNA through, natural selection. If you're smart enough to be naturally selected, or handsome enough, or beautiful enough. And therefore, the highest I can hope to achieve in this life is to dominate my environment, control my experiences, they're mostly pleasurable, and propagate my DNA. I mean, I've simplified it a little bit, okay? But that's basically what the materialist story tells us. And most of us grew up with this from our mother's milk. My mother's a wonderful woman, and, but that's the story we've kind of grown up with. As I say, there's a few religious communities that don't accept that, reject that, but this is a story we're telling ourselves all the time about who and what we are. Now, it's important to realise that this is a story. It's not proven by science. It's a metaphysical belief that the essential reality of the universe is atoms and dead matter. Obviously, it's a useful hypothesis in science, but it's never proved. It's taken as a starting point to deconstruct. I mean, I studied physics, as Lalitaratna said, deconstruct everything into manageable bits and build it back up. But it's not proven. It's a metaphysical belief. Now, this story has some negative tendencies, negative shadows with it, which has taken me many years as a Buddhist scientist, or a scientist who became a Buddhist, to see the way the story impacts on the spiritual life. One of the consequences of the materialist story is that you just end up exploiting the environment and other living beings, because it's all dead stuff. It doesn't really matter. So, it cuts your empathy with the rest of the world. And what empathy there is, I mean, I'm not saying human beings are fundamentally selfish. We can be very generous and empathic. But what empathy there is often tended to that group that supports me and propagating my DNA, so my family or my nation, or, we tend to shrink it down because of this story. And one of the tendencies of this materialistic story, which is a nihilistic story, if you want to label it philosophically, is that in the end, everything gets subordinated to the self and its desires and its pleasures. So it's a very poor story. Some of its consequences are very poor. They damage us as individuals, and they damage the world. So that's the materialist story. Now I'm going to tell you the Buddhist story about who and what they are. I'm going to ask Lalitaratna to read the next short excerpt from the Pabhasara Sutta, the luminous mind. This is the Buddha's version of who and what we are.
Luminous, bhikkhus, is this mind, but it is obscured by greed, hatred, and delusion. The uninstructed worldling does not understand this as it really is. Therefore, I say that for the uninstructed worldling, there is no development of the mind. Luminous, bhikkhus, is this mind, and it is freed from greed, hatred, and delusion. The instructed, noble disciple understands this as it really is. Therefore, I say that for the instructed, noble disciple, there is development of mind.
Good. So if we take the Buddha's vision of who and what we essentially are seriously, that the fundamental basis is of our mind is luminous consciousness, then how is this different from the materialist story? Well, it's a metaphor, obviously. The Buddha's using the metaphor of light. What does that tell us? Well, light radiates, it expands outwards, it warms. So the nature of mind is clear, expansive, and warm. And it's essentially, consciousness is essential to what it is to be a human being. It's not some strange byproduct of dead matter. It's an essential aspect of what it is to be a living being. And this mind, this luminous consciousness expands with loving kindness, with metta, the meditation that we do. And light expands in a way with no limits. It just goes out into space as far as it can until it encounters something and reflects off that. So, your consciousness is like that. It's got an element that expands and connects with no limits. Light beams can cross and interpenetrate without obstruction. So we're an indivisible part of this universe. Everything we do goes out there, whether you do for good or for bad, skillful or unskillful, it makes a difference. It really makes a difference. And this light has a quality of knowing. Light is like you see something and you recognize, it's illuminated. Your consciousness illuminates experience. It illuminates the world. So there's a knowing. And light is also very connected with beauty. The light showing the beauty of a sunset over the Fensendturm or whatever, over the river or the lakes. When you see light, there's often a sense of beauty. Light and beauty are often quite interchangeable. So, the Buddha's saying this is what we're really like. We are fundamentally luminous consciousness with these defilements or obscurations that come because we're not liberated human beings. Greed, hatred, illusion take control, but your basic nature is luminous consciousness. These are two very, very different stories. Neither of them you can prove scientifically, but I know which story resonates with me and which is, makes more sense to me. The Buddha's story, I think, is a much more appropriate and liberating, enlivening story, especially for our times in these dark times. And another wonderful consequence, a surprising consequence of the Buddhist story, is that this luminous mind that warms the world and connects us, it's not personal. The luminous consciousness is something that isn't just mine. We share it between human beings, and we share it with other living beings, the animals. This consciousness is everywhere. I want to make some big New Age statement here, but I'm just saying, look at your experience. There's light, there's illumination of mind everywhere we look in this living world. And what the Dharma invites us to do is to truly orient ourselves with this truth and become individuals who can manifest their unique portion of the light. Every one of us is different. We've got different conditionings, and you'll manifest that light, that creativity, that warmth, that clarity in your own unique way. That's the wisdom of uniqueness, of the Buddha Ratnasama. There's another Buddha who's that we're all equal. Ratnasama, we're all equal, and Amitabha, we're all unique. So both principles need to be taken into account. So how do we manifest this light in our unique way? We have to become individuals. We have to become someone who can see what the nature of our life is and really creatively respond to that. And the first and probably most important step in becoming an individual is to realize that your actions do have consequences, that it really matters what you do, and you take responsibility for that. So I'm going to ask Lalitaratna to read the next reading, which speaks about this, from the Dhammapada, first two verses of one of the most famous Buddhist texts, The Way of Dhamma.
Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with an impure mind, suffering follows even as the cartwheel follows the hoof of the ox drawing the cart. Experiences are preceded by mind, led by mind, and produced by mind. If one speaks or acts with a pure mind, happiness follows, like a shadow that never departs.
So here the Buddha is expressing the law of karma. Actions have consequences, and if you act with a pure mind, with love, generosity, clarity, happiness will follow for you and others. If you act with an impure mind, with the hatred, the greed, delusion, then suffering will follow. And in this sense, that's one of the Buddha's most fundamental insights, liberating insights, that actually there's a point here where we can do something. We have a choice, whether we're going to act from the pure mind or the impure mind makes a big difference. And it makes a difference what kind of person you will become. So this is a really fundamental point in the Buddhist teaching. We can take responsibility for ourselves as individuals and for recreating who we will be in the future. And there's another reading here from our teacher Sangharakshita about being an individual and taking responsibility. So I'd like to ask that to read that.
So, to act without thinking of the consequences of one's actions is irresponsibility. To act bearing in mind the consequences of one's actions is responsibility. To the extent that one acts responsibly, one is an individual. To the extent that one acts without responsibility, one is not an individual. So if one wants to become an individual, one must learn to act responsibly.
Easy to say, a bit harder to do. But here we begin to see how the transforming of self and world go together. Because these are the first, you can see here the first two great practices of the Buddhist path, generosity and ethics. That's really where the Buddhist path starts. Generosity is that moment in which I turn away from what can I get to what can I give. And it's that fundamental turning away from the selfish little bubble of me into your relationship of connection, empathy with the world. So often it's said that the path starts with generosity. If we can't even make that little generous act turning, we're like a rat caught in a trap. It's me and my needs and my desires, and that's the most important thing. And I go, no, Rijumati, you're not the most important thing in the universe. And frankly, no one in this room is the most important thing in the universe. So that moment really changes everything. And that changes the world as well, because your relationship becomes one of connection and giving and supporting. That's beginning to change the world. Now, the Buddhist tradition values generosity very, very highly, and there's a huge amount written and said and spoken. There are great talks on Free Buddhist Audio, great books and things. So I'm not going to go over it because there are plenty of resources. I'll just give you one list to think on, but generosity is where it starts. So what can we give? That's a classic Buddhist list. What can we give? Well, we can give material things and we can give money. And of course, the Berlin Buddhist Center needs plenty of money. So, you're most welcome to give here. They're building a wonderful retreat center. So think of that. But you can also give your time and your energy, connecting with others, being part of a team that helps run classes and whatever activity it is. That's a wonderful way. There's so much satisfaction. Lalitaratna and I were talking about this yesterday, in the joy of giving. It's such a pleasure when you're involved in that giving way. Now, the Buddhist tradition also values very highly the giving of courage, the freedom from fear. So much fear and anxiety in our world at the moment. People can be overwhelmed. They often come to the Buddhist center because of their anxiety, and underneath that is a fear. I'm not in control. I don't know what to do. So giving courage. Just like it's okay. We can do something about this. That's a really important gift. Obviously, we live in very privileged societies. Education, material supports to our health, wonderful things that our society provides. Very, very important gifts. life and limb as part of the classic lift. Sometimes people are willing to sacrifice life and limb, their body, to help others or give to us. Some of the most inspiring stories of our species are people who've laid down their life for others. In the Buddhist tradition, we also emphasize giving your merits away. That means, you get a bit happier through your meditation and sort of your spiritual life is going on. You have to give that way too, because if you hold on to it, it goes a bit sour, it goes a bit off, doesn't work, So we give our merits away for the benefit of others. And lastly in this list, perhaps the most important gift in a way, is the Dharma. Giving individuals the tools that they need to change their life to become free, happy, creative, more free, more happy, more creative. That's a really great gift. So all of that is part of this changing of self, which begins to change world. And then the other foundation of the Buddhist path is ethics, sila. As I've said, from the Buddha's point of view, inevitably our actions flow outward. Everything you do makes a difference. It perfumes the world. Or perhaps I should say, if you act in an unskillful or a harmful way, it's a stink. It stinks the world. People who act with a lot of hatred and selfishness, it's a bit of you want to get away from it. But someone who's generous and kind and empathic, you're attracted. That's the skillfulness. It's like a perfume. So our actions really flow out. We must start by paying attention there. And take responsibility for that. It's quite simple. You have a choice in every moment of your life. There's a choice. Am I going to go with that self-centered reaction, or am I going to do something more creative? It's always there in every moment. I know we've all got baggage. We all came into this world and we've been conditioned, and sometimes it's hard to make the right choice, but it's always there. It is always there, I promise you. And this is fundamentally the way to live well and live happily. If you act ethically, skillfully, from love, generosity, clarity, life will improve, and the people around you will notice it. It's the way to happiness in the long run and freedom. So this is how the transformation of self and world interact. As we become truer, more real individuals, more authentic, we become more sensitive to others, we become more sensitive to the world. And in some ways, you then have to deal with the fact that suffering may affect you more because you've opened up a bit, instead of closing in your little bubble. And we can't ignore what's going on around us. The spiritual life that tries to separate itself is in the long run not going to work. You can't ignore the fact that there's wars, there's climate disruption and so on. Subhuti, who's one of the great teachers in our order, he's got a little aphorism I like. He says, the only way to bear the suffering in the world is to be involved in ending it. The only way to bear the suffering in the world is to be involved in ending it. So it's not all on your shoulders or my shoulders, but you're doing your bit, whatever it can be, purifying your heart, helping it. Then you can kind of bear it. But otherwise you have to shut yourself off or disappear. It's unbearable sometimes. So this brings me to one of the key points I want to make in the talk, is do Buddhists have a political agenda? Do Buddhists have a political agenda, yeah? And many people think that because we Buddhists are concerned with meditative, transcendental experiences, that we don't have a political agenda. But actually that's completely wrong. It's precisely because we are concerned with creating the conditions for people to have rich, meditative, transcendental experiences that we have a very radical political agenda. And this is debatable. These are my own particular reflections. I'm sure some other order members would think of it a different way. But I'm going to highlight 3 elements that are fundamental to a Buddhist political agenda. So the first is that unconditional love is the only way. Metta is the only solution. And, in the verses of Dhammapada, just after the ones that Lalitaratna read, the Buddha says, not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal rule. Not by hatred are hatreds ever pacified here in the world. They are pacified by love. This is the eternal law. Now, we won't hear the Karaniya Metta Sutta, the Buddha's classic discourse on love. It's not quite time for that today, but have a look at that. It's well translated. Lots of good translation. That the Buddha is very clear about the nature of unconditional love. So if you take this seriously, then this vision of unconditional love has some very concrete and political consequences. It means make all beings be happy, not just some of them. And that means we have to take into account the needs of everybody, not just my political party, not just my group, not just my species even. It's all beings. So it's not a politics that is party political based, like most politics is. We're trying to knock down the socialists, knock down the right wing, the Greens are knocking down that. You've got to take into account everybody. And that's a big conversation. But if you don't, well, the principle is loving points for all, so that's a principle. But also you can see it doesn't work, because if my party, my group, my nation wins now, the resentments and the unhappiness for the losers plays on. I mean, look at 20th century Europe, one group won this and the other group resented it, and we just ended up tit for tat. The Yugoslavian war, what happened with the Croats and the Nazis, and then 50 years later it's the Serbs, and it just goes on. So you can't have a politics based on my party wins, huh? So that's a fundamental principle of Buddhist political agenda. It's got to be for all beings and all the animals and the trees, we have to include them too. And this requires deep levels of cooperation to resolve these problems, but it can be done. I live in Catalonia, and in the 1930s, before the Civil War, the Republic had tremendous levels of cooperation. The factories, the actual production went up. As the corporation, the vision, the inspiration of the Republic, it was destroyed by the conflagration between communism, Nazism, fascism in Europe in the 1930s. But, cooperation on that level can happen on political levels. It's quite amazing, the story of Catalonia during the Republic. So that's the first principle. Second principle, we want a society that conforms with the law of karma. Your actions have consequences, his actions have consequences, her actions. And so obviously our social structure must reflect that, and that is the work of our justice system. So we want to support a justice system that's based on universal values, not just local mores, local prejudices. Some countries will have it inscribed in their laws, things that are just about this religion or just about that group. Well, no, we want a universal justice system based on the law that actions have consequences. Because if you don't restrain the unskillfulness, it can grow and grow, because human beings, we're like that, If you don't take responsibility for yourselves, your hatred, your selfishness can just grow and grow. So society has to contain that in some way. How you do that is complicated political debate. Is it punishment? Is it rehabilitation? But you have to have some kind of system that's based on true ethical values. We have to not be naive about the forces of selfishness at work in the world. There are men like, to take two big names, Trump and Putin. They will use their power, they will manipulate us by pushing the buttons. They'll press the nationalism button, they'll press the immigrant button, they'll press the greatness of our nation button. And the whole population is being manipulated. If we're not aware and emotionally intelligent of ourselves, through social media and things, people like this will manipulate populations to do brutal things, Don't let the propaganda do that to you. Be responsible for your own intelligence and listen to the news, not just what you think they want you to hear, but what's behind that, As they say, there's a famous saying, in war, truth is the first casualty. So we have to be quite intelligent about how we receive the news, because a lot of it has an agenda behind. So that's the second principle, a society based on true ethical values. And third, and that's the last principle I want to talk about, and then I'll begin to wind up the talk, it's really fundamental that the light, wherever that luminous mind is shining most brightly, whichever human beings can manifest it most brightly, must be allowed to permeate our society, yeah? Because there are so many selfish and cynical voices, and that light gets drowned out. Now, if we don't struggle for this, the light of clarity, kindness, and generosity to shine through, then, friends, forgive me for putting it crudely, we're buggered. You know, it's like the voices of selfishness and the powerful and the limited benefits for the few will take over, you know. So it's really important that some of us protect and promote the influence of the light. That's to say, the voices of clarity, kindness, generosity. Or saying the same thing in a different way, we must create conditions so that human beings can grow and become real individuals, so that you and me, us here, others in the world can grow and become real individuals, grow spiritually, and some of them can even wake up and become Buddhas. We have to strive for that, you know. And I'm not talking just about Buddhists, huh? You know, if I think of a man who moves me to tears when I think of his influence on the world, I think of Nelson Mandela, because South Africa was heading, after decades of brutal racism and oppression by a minority, it was heading for a bloodbath. It was heading for a brutal bloodletting. This one man, through the sheer stature of his moral stance, his character, he said, no, we are not going to do that here. And he stopped it. I mean, there was some brutal things happening, but it could have been hundreds of thousands of people. You know, so that light shone through that man at that time. He was in the right place and he had the moral weight to do it. He saved that country from a really awful tragedy. So we have to protect wherever the light you hear it, where you hear the light of truth, kindness, clarity, we have to promote that. So, you know, this is part of our political agenda. We have to enable light to shine forth without obstruction, so that our culture can be warmed by those human beings who have the clarity, have the kindness, have the generosity. And for us as Buddhists, you know, for us here in the Buddhist Centre here or in Barcelona, that means making the Dharma available to people so that you and me can grow and use those tools which are well tried and tested. You know, that's the particular gift that Buddhists and people practicing Buddhism, aspiring to practice, can give the world. You know, we have a very clear and coherent understanding of what those forces are that need to be transformed to benefit self and world. I mean, in a way, you can never finally sum that up. What is the Dharma and what are we talking about? Even to call it light, to call it luminous mind, is slightly to me falsified, you know. That's the paradox of spiritual life. It's something that fundamentally is beyond the words, but we reach at it through metaphors like this one. So, yeah. How are we doing for time?
Yeah, good. 10 minutes.
Okay. Yeah, so I think that's very much our special gift as people on a spiritual path. You know, it's important that there's the social, economic, the ecological movements, and we can cooperate with them to the extent that they are, we see that there are universal principles at work. But some of us have to really work to promote these values of the light in society, because not many people are willing to do that these days. You know, the church, which was a force for this discourse throughout Christian European history, it's lost a lot of prestige. A lot of people don't respect, you know, years of power. It was corrupted in some way. I mean, there are still obviously people really living authentic spiritual lives within the Catholic Church, but that isn't where people are turning to for vision and leadership. And the forces, as I've said, of materialism, many religious communities have just shut themselves away in fundamentalism, just rejecting it all, and it doesn't really help anyone. You know, you just get a little bubble that's separated from the world. Now, the arts, the romantics, you know, here in Germany and also throughout Europe, in Britain, where I'm from, they've been a force communicating these values, but also these days they're so saturated by consumerist values, by money and by political theory. It's very hard to separate. There is real art being done and people communicating value through art, but it's so mixed up with those values. And liberal humanism, it's a bit on the decline in the West with populism and other. It's been a force for tremendous freedom, but it's a little bit spent its time. You know, I was brought up in the Anglican Church. I'm from England, and there's nothing wrong with the Anglican Church, but it's very nice and it's a bit dead. You know, it's not going to change the world anymore. You need something more radical. Huh? Liberal humanism has lost its edge. It's become insipid. And as I say, if there's no one promoting this vision of the ethical, the light, the clarity, the empathy, and the love, then materialism and the big corporations will gobble up everything. So it's really, that's our gift. We have to practice and we have to communicate that. Now, I've said it feels quite heavy, doesn't it? Do we need a joke?
No.
No, okay. He's looking serious. We shouldn't despair, okay? So don't despair.
I'm thinking about the chocolate lottery. Can I say?
Yeah.
I did prison work, and one day this prisoner said, "How many in your Sangha?" And we were only small. I said 12. And he counted out 12 bars of chocolate. This is in prison. He said, "I won the chocolate lottery."
Aww.
And this is for your Sangha. So even in prison, they're practicing generosity. I thought that was amazing. You know, this is my meditation group in prison. Carry on. There you are. That's a light note.
Yeah, thank you.
The chocolate lottery.
So, you know, that's our particular gift, is promoting the Dharma in the world. But there are many, many other communities that in their own way do the same, they're doing the same thing. As I've said, social and ecological activism, there's some very inspired people working there. And there are tolerant and ecumenical spiritual communities in all the traditions, you know. In the arts, there are still people communicating art in its sublime mode, the way that lifts us up to a greater vision. And then you can see, when I connect with people in pagan or New Age, sometimes you can find it there. And there are new movements in philosophy and science. Some great thinkers like Carl Jung, but also more recently, the critique of materialism. What I've told you at this beginning about the materialist story, that's a philosophical critique coming from some great thinkers. So, you know, there are movements of renewal of these values and the like in our society. We're part of that. You know, the Berlin Buddhistisches Tor is part of that. Rijumati is part of that. Other social, ecological, spiritual movements are part of that. We're renewing the power of the sacred, the transcendence, you know, words that are a little bit debased, in our society in the 21st century. And it's so important to do that because the world's burning. And it's very healing and inspiring to connect with people from other communities. We won't share all their ideals and values, but you can see, you know, these people have vision. They're working for the benefit of all of us. It's a very inspiring thing to do. And we as Buddhists have our particular gift to that renewal of the light. There's a nice quote from Al Gore, who did the film Inconvenient Truth and was a great promoter of ecological awareness in America. He said, a lot of people go straight from denial of our problems to despair without pausing in the middle and doing anything about it. You know, a lot of people go from denial to despair without pausing in the middle and doing something about it. So we can pause in the middle and say, how can I work on myself and how can I connect with others? Huh? So there we go. That's the basic Buddhist political agenda. It's radical, it's pragmatic, it's got to be based on love for all living beings, unconditional love, metta. We need a social order and support, you know, to the extent that the police and the law institutions are based on real law. We should support them. We need that. And we need to ensure that the luminous mind, wherever that voice of clarity, kindness, transcendence is happening, we allow it to come through. We allow it to be heard and not let the cynical, destructive and the isms, all the different isms, break it down. It's so easy to not hear the true voice. Eh? And the world will be a much different place if we can achieve this. Eh? So I'm going to sum up, and then Lalitaratna will read a poem at the end. I'll just mention that. Lots of twists and turns there, but just in a couple of minutes I'll sum up. So the world is burning, and it's not new. So, don't worry, it's not new. We had a period of relative stability since the Berlin Wall came down, that great moment. But that's finished to some extent, in wars in Ukraine and so on. It's not new, but in some ways it's worse because the threat to the whole world with so many of us and so many technologies is intensified. But the Buddha saw the world was burning, so it's not new. And neither just focusing on your personal change nor just focusing on the external is going to be enough. We have to do the two together. It's the two wings of the bird. We have to transform self and world. Sangharakshita has a fantastic series of lectures about this transformation of self and world. And the story of the story you tell yourself of who you are, it really matters, especially now in these times. Do you tell yourself the materialist story? I'm just made of dead atoms, and it doesn't really matter what I do. That story, in my opinion, is bankrupt. And we have to really see it as bankrupt. It's not scientifically proven. It's a metaphysical belief. The Buddha's story is that fundamentally we are luminous mind, luminous consciousness. That's essentially what we are, and that has many consequences. If we can eliminate these veils of self-centeredness, things can flow out in a new way. To do that, we have to become individuals. Oh, there's the police doing their job. To do that, we have to become individuals, realise that our actions have consequences, and work on those first two fundamental building blocks of an individual life, your generosity and your ethics. It will change the world, and it'll change you for the better. And the Buddhist political agenda, unconditional love for all beings. It doesn't work, this party politics, that we're going to win and you're going to lose. It doesn't work. Promote the social order that supports actions have consequences, and create the conditions so that the voices that speak the truth, the light, can be heard in our society, not let them be drowned out by cynical voices. And our particular contribution as Buddhists in the 21st century, we have a clear vision of the path and the transformation of self and world, and we need to give that as generous as we can. And lastly, we're not alone. Many other communities, political, social, ecological, spiritual, are trying to do the same thing, this renewal of values, 21st century, renewal of the sacred, renewal of the transcendent, renewal of the good. We have to cooperate with them, certainly to the extent that we can see they understand Pratitya Samuppada's condition code reduction. We can say, yes, I agree with you, and those principles are universal. So last thing is a poem by a wonderful American poetess, Mary Oliver, called The Journey, which I think what she does in this poem is communicate the process of the light arising in the individual and her committing to it. So, Lalitaratna, The Journey.
Okay. One day, you finally knew what you had to do and began. Though the voices around you kept shouting their bad advice, though the whole house began to tremble, and you felt the old tug at your ankles, "Mend my life," each voice cried, but you didn't stop. You knew what you had to do, though the wind pried with its stiff fingers at the very foundations, though their melancholy was terrible. It was already late enough and a wild night, and the road full of fallen branches and stones. But, little by little, as you left their voice behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice, which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life that you could save. That's it. You.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this talk, you are warmly invited to visit Buddhistisches Tor Berlin in Kreuzberg. We offer meditation, Dharma talks, and courses that support practice in everyday life. You'll find more information in the episode description.